I'm happy to see you all here for tonight's presentation on Modernism a la mode. This afternoon's presentation. It will take two parts. The first part is a presentation by our special guest. The second part will be a panel discussion with our special guest and some FIT faculty. So that should be engaging. Dr. Elizabeth Sheehan is an assistant professor of English and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Oregon State University. And her research and teaching interests are in late 19th and 20th century American and British literatures and cultures, with a focus on modernism. Her work engages visual and material culture, fashion theory, studies of race, ethnicity, and feminist theory. And her new book just came out, Modernism a la mode, Fashion and the Ends of Literature, is what she's here to discuss today. So please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Sheehan.
Thank you so much, Jerry, and thank you to all of you for being here on what I know is an especially tough week to be actually in school rather than elsewhere. So I really appreciate everyone's coming today. And I wanted to really especially thank Gina Mato, Amy Lemon, of course, Jerry Zuly, Patrick Knisley, and Nadine Dealey for making this visit possible. And also thank in advance Justine DeYoung and again Jerry and Sarah Bird for agreeing to be part of the panel after this. It's really exciting to be at a place where literary studies and fashion studies are coming together in such clear and obvious ways. There are not a lot of places in academia that that's happening, so this is really thrilling to be able to share this with you today. So I'm not going to be talking about necessarily the book in general. I'm going to give a kind of snapshot of a couple of pieces of one of the chapters while kind of gesturing to bigger themes that are in the book. But if anybody wants to ask questions about, what else is said, or what other writers, for example, D.H. Lawrence, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and also the designer Paul Poiret, whom I talk about largely in the book, but that won't sort of come up in this talk. I'm happy to talk more about how they relate to fashion. And also I have a chapter on a lot of the writers and figures of the Harlem Renaissance. So if you're interested in issues of fashion in the Harlem Renaissance, I'd love to talk about that too. So today I want to start by revisiting a fairly little-known moment in fashion history of the early 20th century, and it involves Virginia Woolf and the Bloomsbury Group. So the Bloomsbury Group is famous for being a collection of friends who included some of the most influential British artists and intellectuals of the 20th century. And they included Woolf, they included E.M. Forrester, the economist John Maynard Keynes, the art critic and artist Roger Fry, as well as the painters Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell. And Vanessa Bell was Woolf's sister as well. So Bloomsbury was really known for writing, painting, interior design, but it's not really known for its clothing design. However, its sort of engagement with clothing design was really key to Bloomsbury because it engaged in clothing design during this crucial period of World War I. When the groups were really, the group became a space for pacifists and for conscientious objectors in the midst of incredible enforced compulsory nationalism and indeed the imprisoning of people who often were conscientious objectors in Britain. So part of what I want to start out by talking about is how actually dress design was key to Bloomsbury's sort of carving it out a space for those kinds of resistances. So this happened because actually just before the war, in 1913, Fry, Bell, and Grant had founded what's called the Omega Workshops, and you'll see a couple images here. That was an artist collective that produced decorative art, furniture, and textiles, and they used what Fry famously dubbed the post-impressionist style, which was supposed to describe the aesthetic of modernist painters working in Paris in that time, like Picasso and Matisse. But by the time that war broke out, about a year and a half later after the founding of the Omega really also became a meeting place for pacifists and conscientious objectors. And I should also note, for those maybe more familiar with the US World War I context, both Britain and the US, the state really mobilized in order to oppress dissent in very, very brutal and active ways in both places. So funds, though, from the Omega, made from its products, started going to Quaker relief efforts in France. It also supported Bell, Grant, and his lover, David Garnett, who all moved outside of London so that the two men could find farm work that might actually legally qualify as the kind of work of national importance that the government would recognize and therefore not jail them for not fighting. And it was actually in 1915, as the fighting was spectacularly intensifying, that Bell decided to launch a dressmaking department at the Omega. And she did so, in fact, with the support of one of Britain's most prominent pacifists, Lady Adeline Morell, who was also the wife of Philip Morell, one of the very few members of Parliament to openly oppose Britain's entering the war. So the truth is, unfortunately, few examples and photographs of Omega garments survive, but evidence suggests, you can see a little bit here, that they were often really bold in terms of their color, in terms of their textile design. And so histories of Omega fashion often actually quote a letter from Woolf to her sister Belle, and I'll share part of it with you here, in which she says, "My God, what colors you are responsible for. Karen's clothes almost wrenched my eyes from the sockets, a skirt barred with reds and yellows of the vilest kind, and a pea-green blouse on top, with a gaudy handkerchief on her head, supposed to be the very boldest taste. I shall retire into dove color and old lavender, with a lace collar and lawn wristlets." So Woolf's reference to Victorian styles, dove color, lavender, lace, is clearly facetious. But actually, she's really on target in terms of British fashion, because by 1915, a lot of British fashion magazines had in fact announced a kind of return to these sober, more traditional colors and often more traditional feminine silhouettes that were supposed to be in keeping with the sort of spirit of patriotism that was accompanying the war. So in effect, this sort of return to those kinds of styles gave the magazines a way to justify any kind of interest in the fashion in the midst of war. But of course, as Woolf's comment makes clear, in contrast to that kind of return to traditional styles, the Omega really refuses that, but they're doing so also not actually necessarily by breaking a lot of new ground in fashion, but kind of looking back to an immediate pre-war moment that was associated with a kind of broader avant-garde that then the British press came to kind of label as foreign influences that then had to be kind of purged from British fashion during the war. So in fact, you can kind of see this connection to the avant-garde that's going on in Bloomsbury fashion by the fact that Woolf's reaction very much kind of rehearses the kind of shock you're supposed to see when you see something avant-garde, right? That's the reaction she sort of performs for her sister. But the truth is, despite this letter, she actually did buy and wear a bunch of garments that she bought from the Omega. And in one letter, she actually said, quote, "I think even as an advertisement, I should pay the Omega, as I'm always being asked who made my things." So this is important because it's coming in 1916. It's coming over a decade before Woolf starts to kind of become famous, and certainly well before she becomes really an icon of Bloomsbury intellectualism. But here she's imagining herself as a kind of representative of this community. So just to be really direct here, right, to represent the Omega in this period meant to support a subculture that sheltered both political and sexual nonconformity. So this is at a time when men would be jailed both for not fighting and for having sex with other men. So one kind of offhand quote about Bloomsbury is that they lived in squares and loved in triangles, right? So this is a community that was very much about sexual nonconformity. So the Omega here is really providing resources for also then literally and figuratively resisting the kind of uniformity that the British government is then insisting on from its citizens. And at this time, the government really targeted both men's and women's dress. So conscientious objectors, as you can see an example of this on the right, were specifically targeted for not getting into khaki. And here, this is a newspaper clip mocking a conscientious objector and indicating that when he kind of finally comes to his full duty and sense of himself as a man, he'll get into khaki. And also, this was a time when the government was trying to target women's spending on dress by saying that, controlling that spending and indicating instead that women should spend their money effectively on savings and war bonds. So these two posters give you a little bit of a sense, especially the middle one, of how women's spending is being targeted in that way. So it's in this context then, right, that Bloomsbury is launching this dressmaking department, really flying in the face of this rhetoric. But this turn to dressmaking also raises questions about the possible limits of Bloomsbury's efforts to resist the war. And Woolf takes up that question much later when she writes a biography of her friend Roger Fry right before World War II. She's looking back on his life, including his involvement in the Omega, and really wondering, what difference has his life made? What difference has the kinds of projects, artistic projects, writing projects that he invested in his life in, what effects have they had? And implicitly, she's asking about the impact or the importance of her own writing. And interestingly, when she's writing about this period of World War I, she suggests that the Omega was a pre-war venture that actually collapsed in the face of World War I. So in her biography of Fry, even as she's trying to celebrate his accomplishments, she effectively suggests that the Omega was a nice attempt, but in the face of war, it just couldn't stand up to that kind of pressure. So throughout her work, Woolf really does remain preoccupied with this question of what can art do, what can culture do, what can fashion do in the face of war. And she really continues to write about also the experience of war and the dynamics of fashion. And specifically, she's returning again and again in a lot of her subsequent works to try and use fashion to think through what can artists do. So I want to now turn to reading a short story that I understand students in Professor Amato's class have read, Virginia Woolf's The New Dress, to talk a little bit about how she thinks about fashion, what fashion can help us to do. And then after that, I'll turn to talking about Woolf's anti-war essay, book-length essay, 3 Guineas, and how she also puts fashion at the center of that. But to give you sort of my argument up front, in short, my claim is that Woolf's work really helps us to see that fashion itself is not necessarily a form of resistance that one might design or wear, but instead becomes a way to feel out and perceive the violent systems and structures that shape everyday life. In other words, fashion, rather than actually in the contrast, it's not at all frivolous, but rather it can help one sort of pay attention to the things that really matter. To talk about The New Dress, so it was published in 1927, but she'd been writing it in 1925 at the same time that Woolf was finishing the novel that became Mrs. Dalloway. And this was a period when consumer culture was really booming in Britain, or beginning to boom actually, as it had already in the United States. So her work is very much at this time kind of reacting to what is consumer culture and thinking through how it's reshaping everyday life. And this particular story, as some of you will know, is told from the perspective of a middle-aged woman named Mabel Waring, as she enters, walks around, and then quickly leaves a party hosted by none other than Mrs. Dalloway. And those who might be familiar with the novel, though, might remember that Mabel Waring does not actually appear in the novel itself. This is sort of a spin-off story that Woolf did, but the party that Mabel's at does seem to be the kind of climactic party that's at the ending of the novel Mrs. Dalloway. So Mabel's had a new dress made for this party, but ironically, it's also an old dress. What she's done is she anticipates that she can't afford to be fashionable. So instead, she's gone to an old-fashioned book of her mother's, as she puts it, a quote, a Paris fashion book at the time of the Empire, close quote, and chosen one of the designs for the dress. She chooses this design because she thinks it expresses a time when women were in fact more womanly, as she puts it. And she also chooses it in part because she thinks the more affordable dressmaker that she goes to can actually make this, could make it, as opposed to the dressmaker not being able to really execute the latest fashions. So it's also important to remember, right, this is a time well before ready to wear, so the idea of, lower middle class, as well as upper class people would have been going to personal dressmakers. So it's not a sign that she actually has a ton of expendable cash to spend. So Mabel, as she's at the party, recalls when she first tried on this dress and how incredibly wonderful she felt. She remembers that she looked in the mirror at herself in this dress and saw, quote, the core of herself, the soul of herself. And she felt, quote unquote, pity and love for the dressmaker. And the dressmaker at that time was, quote, crawling on the floor with her mouth full of pins, close quote. So it's telling that in this moment, right, Mabel feels all this connection to this woman, but doesn't actually, for example, hold out her hand and invite her to stand up, right? It's rather about Mabel's sense of how great this dress makes her feel. But even that sense of satisfaction really immediately dies as soon as she gets to Mrs. Dalloway's party. She realizes that the dress is just all wrong in the midst of other people who can actually afford to be fashionable. And Mabel's deep shame at her inappropriate dress then sets off a series of anxious ruminations during which Mabel condemns herself, she condemns her life, she condemns her dreams and her delusions, her aspirations. She even turns to start to diagnose her own anxiety and sense of insecurity as a real symptom of the position that she holds in British society. So she specifically thinks, this is partly because I belong to a once genteel family of 10 children that's kind of come down in the world, and she specifically regrets marrying a man with, quote, a safe, permanent underling's job in the law courts, close quote. So Mabel also, as she's realizing these harsh truths about herself and confronting herself, also is really placing a lot of faith in the effects, the sort of bracing effects of realizing these things, of this critique of herself. So she starts lashing out, not verbally, but rather in her own head, against what she thinks are the sort of false courtesies or the false politeness that the fellow guests are showing her. And she starts really castigating herself for indulging this fantasy that this new old dress might have revealed anything true about herself. So as she's standing there in the midst of Mrs. Dalloway, she thinks, quote, she saw the truth. This was true. This drawing room, this self, the other false, close quote. So she's thinking that she's coming to some kind of true revelation through her anxieties about fashion. But it's important to notice as you're reading this story that even as she seems to sort of confront these apparent truths about herself, Mabel really reinvests in other kinds of fantasies about herself. So for example, she's really remains attached to certain fantasies about empire and about masculinity. So she laments, for example, her, quote, dreams of living in India, married to some hero like Sir Henry Lawrence, some empire builder. Still the sight of a native in a turban filled her with romance, close quote. So in other words, Mabel really wishes to be married to an aristocratic British man who's helping to control and oppress India, which was then, of course, a British colony. And she seems particularly taken by this romantic vision of natives who presumably would be ruled by this hyper-masculine husband of hers. So my point here is that Mabel's sort of self-diagnosis is partly accomplishing this typical Woolfian project of showing how historical and political systems are experienced and become legible at the realm of the everyday, which is one of the things that Woolf is really always trying to do with her work. She wants us to see how seemingly trivial everyday experiences are always part of systems of power and inequality. And certainly Mabel does that in at least realizing that her downwardly mobile class position is part of why she feels the way she does about fashion. But as I've been suggesting, also a reader who also might be paying attention to issues like colonialism, Orientalism, or gender roles will actually perceive that Mabel's sort of self-scrutiny and critique just fails to actually expose those things in the world. And those readers that come to the text, though maybe more attuned to those issues, are the ones who are going to be able to see the limits of Mabel's self-revelation here. So Mabel, in short, fails to really perceive what's actually on the surface. But if we also read her story as a symptom of imperialism, capitalism, and heteronormativity, we also, in reading that way, don't so much reveal what's hidden as actually take into account what Mabel has already clearly on her body, what she's wearing, and how it's been designed. As I noted, Mabel Wright has embraced a design from a time and a place when empire and gender roles were seemingly firmly in place. She imagines that wearing this style, this dress, will make her seem, quote unquote, original. And that word really reveals this paradoxical attempt to repeat an origin. To be original here is not to be new, but to sort of go back to this maternal origin point, this mother's dress point, and to somehow bring it back into the present. In other words, this imperial moment really does represent for Mabel a kind of material origin point when femininity and beauty were supposedly not yet eroded by fashion. And Mabel really misguidedly is trying to single-handedly bring back this moment through a kind of retro style. So my point here is that Mabel is really actually wearing her attachments right on her sleeve, despite the fact that in reading the story, a lot of viewers may not see what stylistic and financial investments her yellow dress is displaying. And here I want to pay attention to the way that it might seem like the person who can really read into this story would be the literary critic, talented at close reading, but in fact somebody who's just looking at the surfaces of what fashion is right at that moment might be particularly able to really understand the dynamics of Mabel's place in the world and what's going on in this story. And that's particularly striking and particularly true because it's readers of Vogue in 1925 who might especially have been able to realize that this story is maybe not just about Mabel, but in fact about Woolf herself and Woolf's position in larger economic and cultural systems, which are sort of worked out through her relationship to fashion. And that's because Woolf sat for a first of a couple photographs that she had in British Vogue in 1925, and she did so while dressed in one of her own mother's garments. And her mother was, as you can, the two pictures on the right are of Woolf's mother. Woolf's mother was a famous British beauty of the time when indeed the British Empire was near its height in the Victorian era. And so she chooses to then actually wear a garment and pose in a way that kind of recalls the then famous pictures of her mother. Woolf's aunt was also a famous early photographer, so the picture on the top is by Julia Margaret Cameron, Woolf's aunt. And so her mother's image as a beautiful icon of white British beauty kind of circulated thanks to her aunt's photography. So here, we don't know exactly, we could say many things about the purpose or the impact of Woolf's gesture in wearing her mother's dress. That is, like so much of Woolf's work, you could say that it protests, that it reflects, or that it reinforces capitalist, imperialist, racist, classist, and gendered systems of power. It's not clear that this either, protests them or reinforces them. It sort of does both. It is true that we might read this image through the fact that Woolf repeatedly expresses some suspicion about fashion. But really, even if we're just reading this, our best way of reading this is, in effect, for us to function a lot like Mrs. Dalloway's maybe other more discerning guests or even readers of Vogue who can really see effectively what's already on the surface, the kind of values that are displayed by the garments on Woolf's body. So this idea of needing to read through fashion is also emphasized in the new dress because Mabel, as she panics about the fact that she's wearing the wrong thing, starts to think that she would be a better person and things would be better if only she thought about literature or history or science or politics or religion instead. So she invests these ideas, those modes of knowing, as somehow invests in them as somehow being superior to fashion. So, for example, she worries about the fact that she is, quote, not seriously interested in conchology, etymology, botany, archaeology, cutting up potatoes and watching them fructify. So at another moment also, Mabel imagines that she should someday be transformed by discovering what she describes as, quote, some wonderful, helpful, astonishing book, a book by a clergyman, by an American no one had heard of, close quote. And she also imagines that someday she'll get over worrying about clothing when she stumbles upon hearing a miner talking about his life in the pit. And she imagines that these experiences will lead her to join some kind of possibly religious order. She imagines, quote, she would wear a uniform, she would be called Sister Somebody, she would never give a thought to clothes again, close quote. She also turns to literature and specifically the figure of Shakespeare as a kind of supposedly superior investment to vestments, to clothing, effectively. So she, in order to calm herself in her anxiety, she often repeats to herself what the story describes as tags of Shakespeare. And here this phrase is really telling because although in 1925 the idea of tags as price tags wouldn't yet have been circulating, there was definitely an understanding that tags could refer to, quote, one of narrow, often pointed pendant pieces made by slashing the skirt of a garment, close quote. That's from the Oxford English Dictionary. So my point here is that by this phrase, tags of Shakespeare, really draws our attention to the way that fragments of text, and especially famous quotations, are like old-fashioned cuts of dress, in that they can be reused and recycled to give a kind of sense of timelessness to what is actually subject to the forces of a given moment. So as I've argued, Woolf was dubious on the one hand about the political and social impact of the Omega's experience with avant-garde fashion. But on the other hand, as we've seen in the new dress, Woolf also seems to be skeptical about dismissals or rejections of fashion, whether that's through attempted claims to kind of timelessness or originality, a la Shakespeare, or turns to seemingly more serious academic topics like conchology, or even political causes, especially because, as she suggests, they might not undo the very colonialist systems that are not necessarily visible to people, even as they're engaging in these seemingly more serious endeavors. So one question might be then, okay, why does Woolf remain so invested and interested in fashion? Because she continues to write about it pretty continually. And what place does fashion have then in Woolf's lifelong feminist and anti-war project? And this is where turning to Three Guineas, Woolf's text from 1938, can really start to give us some answers. So this book it's written in 3 parts. And Woolf proposes that it's written as a response to a letter from who she describes as an educated man, as in a middle-class man with certain kinds of educational privileges, who writes to her and says, okay, what can we do to prevent war? And she says, this is a remarkable moment that an educated man is writing to the daughter of an educated man, i.e. someone who has not had access to formal education, to ask what she might have to say about the possibilities of preventing war. So Woolf's answer, although the book itself is quite long, but Woolf's answer could be summarized quite quickly, which is that she says effectively, educate women, let them make money in the professions, so that'll be a basis of enough independence so that then women can resist these war-making patriarchal systems that they're already caught in. However, part of the reason the book is so long and does not just directly give this answer is because Woolf is also a little bit skeptical about her own prescription. That is, she thinks it's the best solution given the circumstances, but she also sees pitfalls in it. And part of where fashion comes in is her way to kind of negotiate these pitfalls. So what are some of the problems with this possible solution? Well, on the one hand, she wants to draw a lot of attention to the fact that even women who may not have had access to this formal education may already know vitally important things about the world and the way the world works that shouldn't be ignored or covered over in an investment in formal education. So she wants to actually describe and recover those ways of knowing. And so fashion as a way of knowing the world and interacting with the world becomes a way for her to sort of describe what some of that knowledge might look like. Another reservation that she has in this is that, okay, even if women enter both formal education and the professions, that doesn't mean that the system may in fact then just assimilate them into it. And what you'll have is women doing the same kinds of jobs as men and spending their money in the same kind of way, but not any kind of fundamental transformation. And here, interestingly, fashion also comes in there as a way of thinking about a kind of what a better educational system could look like, and I'll talk about that in 1 second. But first, I want to talk about how Woolf uses fashion to think about what kind of knowledge women might have and I would say people in general might have who haven't had access to formal education. And one quote that starts to reveal her attitude towards this is right here, her argument here. She says, quote, "The noble courts and quadrangles of Oxford and Cambridge often appear to educated men's daughters like petticoats with holes in them, cold legs of mutton, and the boat train starting for abroad while the guard slams the door in their faces." So in other words, all the family's education has gone to paying for their brothers to go to Oxford and Cambridge. So when they see Oxford and Cambridge, what it looks like to them is all the things they've effectively given up in order to have their brothers be able to go there. So in this quote, it might seem like, okay, clearly it's worse to have the well-worn, the petticoats with holes in them versus Cambridge and Oxford. But Three Guineas also insists that in fact dress is part of the education that women have that men apparently lack. And she refers to that realm of knowledge as, quote unquote, women's unpaid for education. That understanding of human beings and their motives, which, if the word is rid of its scientific associations, might be called psychology. So In fact, according to Woolf, her vision for what a college should teach, she spends a couple of pages describing what if a college really wanted to prevent war, what are the kinds of things that it would teach. She spends a little while talking about that, and fashion figures in this description. She says this kind of college, quote, should teach the arts of human intercourse, the arts of understanding other people's lives and minds, the little arts of talk, of dress, of cookery that are allied with them. It should explore the ways in which the mind and body can be made to cooperate, close quote. So Woolf gives up this vision, though, when she imagines what a weary headmistress, trying to get money for women's college how they might react or how they might feel to getting a letter like this. And she just realizes there's already so little money going into women's education that to demand this kind of utopian alternative vision of education is just not possible at this time. But it's important to note that Woolf is suggesting not just that the kind of knowledge gained from fashion is going to be a kind of left behind thing or a thing that might run alongside formal education, but actually should be part of the kind of utopian education to come that might actually work towards peace. And in fact, the Three Guineas again and again doesn't just kind of make these arguments, it tries to train its reader to kind of read along in the way through fashion that she would want people to be able to read. And she does that partly by having the only images in the book being those of British government, religious, educational, and military officials dressed in their ceremonial dress. And what she does is sort of imagines what it might be like to be a woman naively encountering these men in their public dress. And she just basically draws attention to how fundamentally absurd they are and decorative they are. And she points out that she has a wonderful episode, actually, in which she talks about a divorce case in which a judge dressed as he would be in the bottom right corner, goes on and on about the fact that, you know, this woman in this divorce case should not be criticized for spending way too much money on fashion because women are inferior and they need some kind of compensation. So that really comes through fashion and dress. And what she points out is, what is the worldview that allows this man to think of what he's wearing as utterly fundamentally neutral and just part of a respectable system, and having no sense of how that's actually part of an investment in dress and an investment in a fashion system, right? So she's trying to train her reader to just see dress effectively, and see all dress as part of this kind of larger fashion system. So here, it's in talking about Woolf's method and also suggesting how Woolf's method might actually be relevant in contemporary ways, it's useful to bring in a conversation about phenomenology. So phenomenology is a philosophical field that really tries to show how all knowledge is experienced through bodies and embodiment. So never are we the sort of transcendent, disembodied knower. All knowledge comes through forms of embodiment and the body's interaction with the world. So that's important for thinking about what Woolf's doing, because effectively she's sort of extending that to say, not only do we experience the world through bodies, we usually experience the world as dressed bodies, and dressed bodies that interact with other dressed bodies. And her work, therefore, is in line with what some contemporary feminists and critical race phenomenologists like Sarah Ahmed have been saying about how we can use phenomenology today. So I just want to give a plug for Ahmed's idea of what she calls a quote-unquote queer phenomenology, and she talks about that as, quote, a phenomenology of being stopped, a description of the world from the point of view of those who do not flow into it, close quote. So what Ahmed is doing is taking seriously the idea that sexual orientation is also literally a bodily orientation, and that means that certain bodies are going to come at the world at different angles, and to pay attention to how a body does or doesn't fit at certain tables or in certain sites. So Woolf's work is really in keeping with doing that kind of phenomenological work. And that's partly through her description of, for example, how out of place an educated man's daughter might feel coming into these public spaces, how her body would not fit. Her body would stand out in certain ways. Her body would not have a place to feel comfortable in these scenes. She's also, in Three Guineas, effectively trying to, as I've suggested, reverse that gaze whereby the kind of invisible, unmarked masculine figure looks at the hyper-visible feminine or racialized other and notices their bodies when men's bodies, white, upper-class British men's bodies remain invisible. So part of what she's doing here is kind of reversing that gaze, just putting them out there as if they're kind of studies of sociological interest. But another thing I want to emphasize is that Woolf isn't just trying to reverse the gaze. She's trying to get us also a little bit outside of just the idea that the gazer should hold power over the thing onto which they gaze at. And she does that partly by really describing, and you'll just take my word for it a little bit, both in Three Guineas and all of her work, and those who've read The New Dress will have a sense of this, how much people feel their way through the kind of textures of the everyday, rather than being these disembodied gazers who can look at something and understand it from afar. So she's trying to give us a sense of how, in fact, we don't always just look at these spectacular things that we then sort of analyze and understand, but we have to sensually feel our way towards them. So that's another way of knowing that she's trying to encourage. So she partly, in Three Guineas, this comes up partly through the way that she describes what she calls public life as, quote, a crudely colored photograph of the world, quote, seen through the shadow of the veil that St. Paul lays upon our eyes, close quote. So St. Paul, famously made an injunction that all women should be veiled in public. So this description, this reference to this veil often also happens right before Woolf gives us these pictures of these men. So she's kind of suggesting that actually the kind of the blockage to view, what might seem like a kind of blockage of the view through the veil, makes people pay attention to texture and indeed the texture of the social fabric in ways that might not be gained by this kind of spectacle, distance vision. And to draw in one more theorist that I think can really help us here, I'll refer to the film theorist Laura Marx. And she describes a difference between what she says is a kind of Renaissance perspective on the world that's in keeping with that kind of distance vision versus what she calls haptic visuality. So haptic being a word for touching that also involves the feeling and orientation of the body. And she argues that when films especially, but we can also think about it as literature, come to these more haptic moments, what happens is not this sense of a stable viewer gazing at a stable object, but you're taken in and touched by the object, you're disoriented by the object, you come into close relation to it, and you're shifted by it. Your sense of sensing the world is shifted. So that's at least her claim for film. And my proposal would be that Woolf, too, is kind of, by bringing people into the close texture of the social fabric and how people move through the world, is really demanding a kind of haptic engagement with the world that could possibly shift the viewer and the relationship between the viewer and the thing that they're viewing. Okay, I think I will stop there. I would love to talk a little bit, if people are interested in talking about fashion also as both a mood and a style. I would really love to think about that too, because I think one of the things that Woolf's doing here too is trying to think of fashion as not just something that's a visual aesthetic, but like in French, right, la mode means both fashion and mood. So she's trying to suggest that fashion is a way we feel through the world, and mood is especially helpful for talking about this, because moods are things, and this is indebted to the philosopher Martin Heidegger. He says moods are things that come out upon us from outside. So whereas it might feel like we have feelings that come from the inside out, moods are things that suddenly sweep us and make us realize how we're not in control necessarily of our own feelings. We're always in a kind of broader context. And I think Woolf is really using fashion as that kind of collective mood that may shape our feelings, the things we pay attention to, without our realizing it. So that's in keeping with her kind of idea of haptic visuality. But yeah, I'll close there and hope that that will give us a bunch of material for discussion and questions. And also thank you again for staying with me and attending to this talk and for being in conversation. Thanks so much.
Hello? Oh, thank you, Felix. Are there questions? I'm actually going to take the privilege of being the sort of moderator today and ask a question right away about the haptic visuality. Do we have kind of a Renaissance idealized eye and idealized gaze versus a more subjective gaze in the haptic visuality that modernism brings in?
Yes, that's exactly, yeah, that's well said. So, right, so
Microphone, please.
Oh, yeah. Right, so Woolf is described as a modernist, and she's often described as a modernist precisely because she's trying to experiment with how writing might give us a really intimate sense of the everyday. So as opposed to a Victorian novel, which might have sort of a set of characters whom you see clearly moving through the world and a plot, you can imagine how that might be compared to a kind of Renaissance gaze of you have a full picture of that person, you may get a story about who their parents were, you know what their living room looks like, you watch them move down the street in London, right? You have this novel is giving you a clear sense of that. Whereas modernist novels, right, just sort of put you in medias res, suddenly you're maybe in somebody's head who's walking down the street, you can't really figure out where they are, but you're incredibly intimately already entwined with their mind, their way of thinking. You can't always grasp that sort of clear way of looking at the world. So Woolf is very much part of that break from the Victorian to the modern, and that is indeed, yeah, one way that her writing is already haptic, already calling into question that idea of the kind of disembodied distance viewer. Thanks. Questions?
Thanks. Great talk. I'm trying to phrase my question well, but you were talking about how essentially fashion is a reflection of society, of the specific moment in time we live in, culture. What I'm curious by is, in your own studies, what have you seen to be the distinguishing factor within, I don't know, the past 30, 40 years in regards to fashion, not necessarily in the United States, but as a species, and what is that reflecting of?
Oh, right, thank you, sorry. No. I'm used to moving around a little bit, yeah. So I think globalization was already happening certainly in the early 20th century, and that's in fact pivotal to Bloomsbury's aesthetic. So for example, they're drawing very much through non-Western traditions, and that has to do with the fact that there already is a global circulation of ideas as well as objects. That said, the accelerating globalization, I think, is definitely something that's, especially stands out in the last 30 years in terms of production. In terms of styles, I would more be interested, I think actually probably people in the audience are greater experts at this than I am. Certainly I will just say as a person, haptically feeling my way through the world, that idea of sort of retro fashions or fashion is always an act of return as much as it's an act of innovation seems completely obvious in terms of the way that, I think, the 90s are back right now, apparently, because I saw the dress that I wore to a bat mitzvah in 1993 on sale for at Urban Outfitters, horrifyingly, about 6 months ago. So I think both this idea, sort of idea of the retro or always recycling of styles and this system of increasing globalization and compartmentalizing of work are both current trends. That said, I think fashion can also give us a structure for thinking about how what might seem firmly located in the past, a la a text from 1938, is also returning. So Woolf's understanding of the ways that seemingly liberal governments, like the British government, is actually deeply invested in fascist ideas of patriarchal political power, a la these military uniforms, is deeply of the moment in terms of thinking about what ways are fascist energies or fascist attachments sort of hiding in plain sight in terms of seemingly liberal democratic governments. So that's not really about fashion, but it is at least about the structure of return that can make what seems old important and new to us again.
One more question, this is a little more specific. I'm really fascinated by the concept of enclothed cognition. You were talking about it, sort of like fashion can be reflective of mood. The clothes you wear really decide the identity you're choosing that day, in a sense. And also I'm really interested how that affects politics and culture. So one of the questions I'm sort of wanting to ask is, I know Democrats wear blue, Republicans wear red. Do you know where that comes from, and where that neuroassociation sort of stems from?
I don't know the red versus blue. That's a good question. I think that politics has always been entwined with aesthetics and fashion. So we can understand that as a long extension of a tradition that traverses, all types of government, whether liberal, communist, fascist, et cetera, aristocratic, monarchical. So I guess I don't know about the specific history, but I think it's just completely in keeping with the link between fashion and politics that's ongoing and global.
Questions? Okay, we'll take about a 5-minute break and then reconvene so everyone can kind of run out, and then we'll reconvene with the second half. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe so. Okay. Yep.
All right, great. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. My name is Patrick Knisley. I'm the Dean of the School of Liberal Arts here at FIT, and we are very proud and privileged and excited to introduce you to this panel of special guests today, including Dr. Elizabeth Sheehan, whom you may have heard in the previous hour. She is an assistant professor of English and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Oregon State, the author of Modernism à la mode, Fashion and the Ends of Literature. And she does research on modernism, fashion, feminist theory, race, affect, photography, and magazines, widely published, and examines the work of such literary greats as Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence, W.E.B. Du Bois, Nella Larsen, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. She works with text and textile and fashion and fact. I love that. She will be joined on the panel tonight by Justine de Young, our own Justine de Young, who's an assistant professor in our History of Art department, specializing in the intersection of art and fashion. She's the editor of Fashion in European Art, Dress and Identity, Politics and the Body, 1775 to 1925. And she contributed to the exhibit called Impressionism, Fashion, and Modernity at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which also traveled to the Musée d'Orsay and the Art Institute of Chicago. She's also the creator of the soon-to-be world-famous Fashion History Timeline here at FIT. Sarah Bird is from our School of Graduate Studies at FIT. Sarah is an archivist, a curator, a fashion historian, and an educator. She curated an exhibit called Time and Place, a site-specific installation on the connections between clothing, photography, and memory. She's also worked with corporations such as Ralph Lauren, where she helped develop the menswear archive, and has done independent research on early 20th century women's novels and related films, the history of American cults and communes, and the role of exhibitions in education. And finally, the moderator, who's also from FIT, is Dr. Jerry Zuly. She's from our English and Communications department. She has a PhD in American literature with a theoretical grounding in cultural studies. Her research focuses on the intersection of historical cultural moments and artistic moments, specifically but not exclusively literary. And she's also an expert in the fantastic in the arts, which sometimes we know as science fiction, fantasy, horror, or the Gothic. There's been a lot of very interesting collaborations happening in the School of Liberal Art and the world of fashion. We have material scientists working with fashion designers. We have art historians teaching fashion theory and history. We have computer technology, working with the fashion department. We have mathematics, professors who are interacting with professors of retailing and fashion. And finally now, long awaited, we have the juncture of literature and fashion. I'm very happy and proud to help present this tonight. So please welcome all our guests one more time, and I'll give it over to them. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. Welcome again. I'm excited to be here moderating this panel, and excited because I think intercurricular cooperation is so useful, and especially in today's increasingly divisive world. I think that if we can, as academics, we can come away from our cozy corners and find a common playground to play in. I think that's wonderful. I also welcome again our special guest, Elizabeth Sheehan, who we've heard a little bit from, but now we're going to sort of add our voices to hers. I'd like to begin, and I hope all of us have something we'd like to contribute that you all initiate, but I thought I would sort of take a step back. It occurred to me while I was preparing for this panel that as we come from different cultural backgrounds, we may mean different things by modernism. And don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to define it. I would never even attempt that. But I would like us to have a temporal conversation about how we feel, when we feel modernism began. The way I sort of phrased it is, are there seminal moments, are there seminal texts or fashions or artworks that we consider to be part of the initial zeitgeist of modernism? And when I say modernism, I mean modernity, if you want to go with the modern and sort of be Benjaminian about it. All things modern, but especially when did we start to see modern? When did we start to see the world in modern terms, I guess, which might mean different things to all of us. One of the kickoffs for me for this was in your earlier book, Elizabeth, you mentioned that literature, modernism as literature that responded to new realms of experience opened by technological and ideological transformation. So I'm especially curious to hear where did it start? When did it start? Not going to ask you what it is, just when did it start happening, essentially. So would anybody like to volunteer to go first?
Well, I can speak in art history, and I guess begin to talk about fashion, although I'll defer a bit to Sarah as well. So I think from an art historical point of view, this is a much debated question, but as I work on the 19th century, I'm going to claim that it starts in the 19th century. But I really do think there is a radical break with the advent of realism and the immersion in the depiction of everyday life, and this sort of interest in and broadening out of audiences and of subjects for art, but also this sort of in medias res, this move away from strictly understandable canvases or stories, that instead you have to, you're sort of plunged in the midst of the scene. I mean, the realists are famous for cropping, right? We associate it with photography, but it starts first in painting, sort of cropping in on the scene and giving us only one specific angle, and maybe not the one we want. So I think in terms of painting and art history, people like Manet in the 1850s, 1860s is where I would probably say modernism starts.
I guess that leaves the fashion.
Sorry.
So the most straightforward, kind of widely accepted idea is that when we see a shift away from the corset at the beginning of the 20th century, we have a strong association with Bois. He's definitely not the first nor the only one to be doing that. Sort of gets a lot of credit for it, I think just because he's so fancy about it. But it really is this return to this kind of classical ideal of the body and a focus on that, and you can see it in the silhouette. So once you leave the corset, you leave the past behind.
Interesting, and I've sort of always, as a literary scholar, I've been trained to kind of say the beginning of the 20th century. But when I started to think about this and thought about actually some of your chapter specifically in Elizabeth's earlier book, I started thinking about some of the ways I discuss modernism with my students. And I always refer to On the Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. I always refer back to that as kind of being the sowing of the seeds for looking at the world in a radically different way. And I ended up choosing a text that surprised me that I chose it, but I ended up choosing Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. as a moment that's real, and going back to 1855. So I find myself allied over here. Partly because of what you were talking about in your text about revisiting history and is it new again or original again, and Woltman, if you're familiar with Leaves of Grass, his book of poetry that was originally published in 1855, and he continued to revise and revisit and reissue for the duration of his life, constantly, do I want to say make it new? I don't know yet, but constantly revising and revisiting. And even the modernist poets, the American modernist poets, referenced their connection to Whitman, referenced that they were kind of the inheritors, the 20th century modernist poets, the inheritors of Whitman. So I kind of want to make that my literary seminal text, going back much further than I expected.
Well, it's interesting because Manet is famous for looking back at the history of painting and redoing it, right? So looking at the classic nude, the Titian's Venus of Urbino, and instead recasting it as a modern sex worker in Olympia. So again, revisiting these sort of classic stories. But I mean, I might even make a pitch for fashion's modernism starting a little earlier because you have that sort of historicism in the early days of haute couture with Charles Frederick Worth, but also I think this idea of fashion democratizing and spreading, and the crinoline being one of the widest adopted fashions. You have this sort of, thanks to the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the department store and all sorts of huge changes in the structure of 19th century society, you really do see fashion becoming possible for a wider swath. And you do, even in the early days, start to see a sense of play and a revisiting of the past.
Yeah, I think I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I'm going last and that we've gotten clear and helpful definitions here, and just note that in literary studies, at least, especially in modernist studies, which sort of presents itself as interdisciplinary, but then actually ends up being mostly about literary studies, there happens to be a kind of ongoing debate precisely about what modernism is, and that currently it's also turning more and more to thinking about what our definitions of modernism do. So rather than specific debates about whom do we put first, thinking about, okay, that our definitions will always be entangled with who we put first and who is it centering and for what ends, and whose scholarship as much as who, in terms of whose literary production is being put first. So, for example, the most expansive definition of modernism is coming from a critic named Susan Stanford Friedman, who says, modernism is anywhere where the new erupts. Let's look at the Mongol Empire as an instance of modernism. And her project is to try to make modernism less Eurocentric. The pushback becomes, okay, we're still starting from our Eurocentric understanding of modernism, and then all of a sudden seeing all these pieces of history that then get effectively assimilated into what is really a Eurocentric 20th century understanding of what modernism is, even if you're trying to gesture towards these other inclusions. So, I would just note that's kind of is ongoing. For my own part, I think mid-19th century, I love starting, although it's more late, but I love starting with Henry James, which is fairly sort of conventional understanding, but also always, signaling that my definition of modernism is always centering certain figures and not others, necessarily.
And I think literary scholars would argue that modernism is kind of delayed in the United States, that we sort of slowly, we were living in the post-Civil War world a little bit less willing to grasp the new in that era. So
it's true in fashion as well.
Yeah, fair enough.
I was a little bit behind the times. Any other response?
Well, I actually, something you said sort of resonated with a comment earlier about defining fashion, and like when you're talking about defining modernism, and I feel like the definition of fashion is very much a huge debate right now, and also this idea of the hierarchy of the language that's being used, and if we're just talking about Western fashion, and specifically European and American fashion, we're not really talking about fashion, we're talking about fashion systems, and I feel like we have to start using that word in that phrase more often now, and clarify that.
Yeah, and there are, I think, parallels between that and the distinction maybe between modernism and modernity too. Is modernism an aesthetic response to modernity? Is it better to talk about multiple modernities to think about how that could be in multiple different places in more flexible ways and more inclusive ways than just talking about, say, fashion versus fashion system. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to kind of move on from our discussion of the new, the idea of the new, and especially Pound's very famous "Make It New" motto for modernism, but a complementary also inability to truly make that break with the past. And you speak in your book about Fitzgerald, and I think that one of the themes that that we've talked about among literary scholars again in Fitzgerald is this inability to break from the past, but also when it comes to the United States, that the best opportunities are behind us. And so how do you envision making it new, but still being able to let go? And sort of Pound saw himself, as he said, as sort of the antenna trying to seek out the new. And you talked in your text about Fitzgerald as sort of the trendsetter, the vector, I believe was the word you used, right? So we're always sort of expanding, magnifying the new, but he still has that connection to the past. I'm curious to know if there are other modes of modernity, if we see that make it new without being able to break from the past going on. And I'm going to start with you because this is in your text, and that gives our other two panelists a chance to think about those things.
Well, effectively, yes. I mean, this, I think, goes back to our understanding of the definition of modernism, that it's always doing intellectual work for us rather than some kind of neutral definition that we then apply. So when we say something is new, it's probably because we're deciding that it's new rather than it's actually never been done before or has no precedence. So I think it's, in effect, is everywhere, that understanding of marking the new as always marking a relationship to the past and always a sort of as much a performance as an actual description of what's going on. Is that in line with what you were thinking in my book? Because you said I was in my book, and then I realized I was not entirely clear.
I guess I was thinking about how there's a certain... Let's talk about Fitzgerald. Let's get specific and talk about the Great Gatsby and Fitzgerald, as you do in your text. And he sees himself as a sort of representative and representing contemporary feminine fashion. Let's just go with the flapper and so he sees himself as that purveyor, as that esquire guy, for lack of a technical term. But at the same time, his texts, in terms of the plot, demonstrate a longing for the past. So it seems, is there an inability to get past that longing for the past while trying to make it new? I think I've made it muddier instead of clearer.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think I don't have anything to add because I think that's precisely the structure of modernism, right? Edgar Pound's Make It New was actually a sort of quotation that he took from a Chinese philosopher. So it gets quoted and recycled as if it's some kind of expression of a break from the past, but it's precisely just a reusing of the past. So the energy of the desire for the new is always entangled, yes, I think absolutely with a nostalgia for the old. And I think Fitzgerald just kind of got that in a way that then allowed him to leverage that in a way that he then became the representation of the 1920s. And he's very self-conscious about that, trying to express the spirit of the age in a certain ways that's going to make him, ironically, the expression of the new, which therefore lasts forever, right? Which is such a fashion construction, right? This is a new classic garment that you're going to wear for the next 30 years, right? So that structure of the new being somehow the constant and the old is so fashion.
I really was feeling that strongly, is that this idea of making it new is what fashion is. It takes the old always. There is, as like a fashion historian, I joke with my design students that it's incredibly hard to impress us because we've seen it all before. And changing something about it is just the making it new. It's updating it to the current lens of understanding. You use a different word to describe it, but you're saying the exact same thing.
Well, and I always tell my both art history and fashion history students, like you can't make something new unless you know what came before, right? And so, I mean, artists, to speak to art history at least, you know, they're constantly in reference to, they're trained in previous styles, and then they have to find their own voice and perspective. And so we're always comparing them against the canon, and, you know, they're comparing themselves against the canon and reacting to it. So I think you can't, even someone who's trying to do something radically different has to know what's out there in order to make that radical shift. And that's actually a question I had for you, if that's okay, which was about the canon. You bring it up in your introduction about incorporating, you know, and you mentioned earlier incorporating sort of non-canonical voices, and you do, you know, some lesser-known texts, and obviously Fitzgerald is someone, you know, I read in high school, right? That's very familiar, and so I know as an art historian and a fashion historian, it's relatively easy for me to incorporate non-canonical voices, simply because images, you know, you can insert them in. They don't take the sort of investment of time and reading and explanation. I think that if you quote a text that no one else has read.
Right.
So I sort of wondered how you balance selecting texts that are more familiar versus lesser known ones, and how that sort of conversation about decentering the canon is playing out in literary studies.
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, in this book, it happened that I tried to ask certain questions about what literature and what fashion could do as a force in the world. And probably because I was already familiar with certain texts, I found some of the best answers in those texts. In other cases, I felt like this was not giving me the answers I wanted. But I think your question, draws attention to the way that something I was trying to sort of talk about in my book, which is that academic knowledge production is always like a fashion system too, right? The new and the non-canonical is not going to be accepted. Your work, frankly, is not probably going to get the same attention if you can't hang it on or attach it to that which is already known. So I think that's just the reality, and I think this is not something that, you know, this would not be a surprise to academics to have them say, but one of the reasons I write about fashion is to try to actually incorporate that into how our work, you know, be frank about that and upfront about that and think about how that shapes our work, rather than just making a gesture to the fact that, oh yes, unfortunately, a project that did completely all non-canonical figures would probably not, you know, be a dissertation and maybe a book that would be approved, unless, for example, it used canonical theorist to sort of hang that work on. So, the answer is less about, precisely how I made that decision, that I was just trying to make clear that I was having to make those decisions, and that fashion was a way of naming having to make those decisions and giving a sort of an understanding of a system for making those decisions.
So my question kind of builds on this, and it's something that I wonder about, not just with this particular literature kind of connection, but my background is definitely fashion heavy, and that's really the basis of all of my training is through material culture and fashion history. And as someone with a different background, how do you approach learning about fashion? How did you kind of immerse yourself in like understanding the terminology and the concepts and the theories?
Right. Probably more haphazardly than I should have. Just a library, and, you know, trying to go to conferences, and making wonderful friends who are also academics who work on fashion, and being in conversation with them and asking them to read my work, not in a systematic way. Yeah, that is just, you know, finding books that I thought were helping me answer the questions that I wanted to. But I think that's a really good question in terms of thinking about, just how does academic work actually happen? Why do these, you know, silos, to use an often used metaphor, get set up? How do you actually interrupt them? I mean, I would imagine this is one institution that sometimes tries to think about that, because it might be focused on fashion, but I imagine...
Well, and certain avenues of scholarship come in and out of fashion, so...
Fair enough, yeah. But so I would sort of turn the question back on you as being situated in a place where conversations could happen more easily or better, as opposed to I happen to be at an institution that didn't have much of a fashion study. There you go, that'd be great.
If I may, I want to return to something that sort of Justine was circling the neighborhood of, and that's the idea of when things that were known in the past but aren't known now, and therefore these were your sources of scholarship. A lot of the texts that you chose are not canonical, but were indeed popular at the time that they were written. And then I'm interested, of course, in the reverse, that texts that were not popular but have become popular, or icons that were popular, fashion items that were, items of dress that were popular and not. And one of the things that we talk about with the flapper is that she's actually, I think, better well known in Fitzgerald's texts than she even might have been at the time, according to some scholarship. I mean, that she's become this very big icon that was much bigger than at the time. And I think that's sort of one of the things that affects our contemporary readings of these texts. And you talked about anecdotes in your own work that are sort of moments and sort of revisit and representing an opportunity to kind of revisit that era. But then it's not really a true reading because you're reading contemporary, big version of something that was really maybe a little smaller at the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that connects to the conversation we were having earlier, and I'd be interested to hear from, those of you with more knowledge in specific fashion history, but the idea that, yes, indeed, the flapper has become a sort of outsized symbol of the 1920s, right? And my argument in the book is that Fitzgerald has a sense that might happen, so he sort of hitches his star precisely to that figure and is invested in both elevating her and then becoming the kind of philosopher of the flapper, i.e. he's connected to her, but he's superior to her because he has the kind of slower temporality of philosophy and pedagogy, where he both teaches the flapper and teaches the reader about who the flapper is. So he's both going to become of the moment, and then he's going to sort of continue and transcend her. So I think that just the way that indeed both popular understandings of the 20s and scholarly understandings continue to reproduce this foregrounding of the flapper is just more evidence of how Fitzgerald was able to shape our understanding of the era. That said, that's without as nuanced a knowledge of fashion history from the early 20th century, where somebody working in fashion history may indeed say, no, the discipline does not overemphasize the flapper. I don't know, I would be interested.
I would love to know what Justine's take on this is too, because I remember very distinctly when I was in my very first fashion history class in 20th century, and this flapper term came up, and it was one of these words that was like banned. Like, we weren't supposed to talk about the flapper.
Interesting.
Because it was, and I recognize now, like, it's more of a stereotypical idea of something. It's not actually grounded into an individual. You can see it in these references. It's in, like, one of my favorite books is called The Flapper Wife, that was written in 1925. And it's a term that we just have to accept that we can use, but I think it means so much more than what this stereotypical idea is, that it's really like a continuation of these earlier, like the modern woman into like the new woman that happens in the 1920s with the freedoms and the right to vote and like the changing social situations, and the fashion is directly related to that, where there's suddenly like skin, a lot of skin, and you also look at the undergarments and you see like there's a lot of looseness to that too, so there's a lot of movement in the body, and I think that's what the flapper really resonates with for me as a fashion thinking person, more so than some of the other literary kind of references.
Well, and I think this is a challenge, that we encounter as professors, as teachers, a pedagogical one, in that it is a convenient shorthand that students immediately recognize. And so I think it does have value to continue to use. And it is, there is always nuance when you dig in, and, when you're teaching, you try to reflect that nuance. But I think in terms of when they're studying for the midterm, it's like, yes, the 20s, flapper, go.
Right.
I think I'm probably biased about this because I was a flapper in a play in elementary school, so I have very fond memories of flapperdom. But I also, Alice Kessler-Harris has suggested that flappers were sort of, I don't want to say designed is probably too strong a word, but fit right into patriarchal structure in their emphasis on frivolity and maintaining femininity while maintaining frivolity. And that this would keep, women seem to be having change in society and taking some agency, showing lots of skin in a Mae West kind of I'm going to own myself way, but that was really just a way of ensuring no serious thought was given. If anybody has any follow-up on that.
Well, in terms of this idea of types being operative and a tool of patriarchy, I'm going to briefly connect it to my own work, which in the 19th century, I particularly study these sort of types of women, whether it be the sex worker, the wife, the Parisienne, this sort of mass-marketed fantasy of sophistication and chic glamour that is still very much operative today. But it's interesting, the types that have stuck around, like the Parisienne, I think is still a fantasy that we all subscribe to as a culture, and those that have fallen away. And so that's one of the things that I, find most interesting about studying the past, is seeing the roots of the contemporary. So in the 1860s, for example, in France, there was this type, the sexy widow. And I guess there's elements of that archetype that maybe still persist, but not to the extent that she sort of dominated the cultural imagination in the 1860s. Not surprisingly, it's the Franco-Prussian War and Paris Commune when we have so many actual widows where the sort of fantasy of that drops out. But
it's like a 19th century version of the French maid. Is that what the...
No, it's just this idea that women have this sort of sexual knowledge. Widows have, of course, sexual knowledge, and they also have to get an entirely new wardrobe when their husbands die, right? Because their mourning dress has all of these expectations. And so there's this real tension between honoring the death and also, reflecting that in your dress, but those dresses are going to be of the latest fashion. And plus, you know all about sex, and you're super marriageable, right, at this moment. And so you can see where the sort of tension arose. But I will circle back to a connection to your own work, which is I was sort of curious. Like I said, I am interested in types because I'm interested in why they're durable or why they go away, because we still are fighting the effects of some of these ideas as contemporary women. But what do you see in terms of the book? Like when you were thinking about takeaways, or obviously we got some insight when you were giving the lecture earlier, but what do you feel like are the strongest takeaways or connections to contemporary life in terms of your way of looking at fashion and at these modernist texts? How do you bring them alive in the classroom or connect them to everyone's lives, if you try to?
So part of the contemporary relevance really did get routed through debates in current debates in literary studies. So I do try to argue for the relevance of those debates to my students. So it's a little bit at secondhand, but I'd say one of the debates that I think modernist literature and fashion can help us most think about that's happening in literary studies and a little bit more in critical theory more broadly is how do we talk about the agency of objects? That is, we think, for example, of something like a table as a passive thing upon which we, set books or that sits there for us, but actually maybe that table has just organized precisely how we're all sitting, how you're oriented to us. It seems like a thing that we've just had control over, but then also if you look at the history of that object, how it's designed, it's, that objects indeed are exerting a kind of agency on us. So I try to make that's a conversation about how to talk about that is happening in literary studies, and I think fashion is one of those things that can so help us to talk about that because it's the object that is most closely on our bodies that we feel like we're manipulating and shaping, but in fact is so deeply shaping us. And shaping our way through the world. So I think modernist texts are particularly preoccupied with the force of objects in the world and ways of thinking about how we interact with objects. So that's one thing that I think is just can be a current thing to attend to, and that fashion and objects and modernism can help us to think about. But I think also just more broadly, it was about how we read the world, that it's always through the lens of the contemporary and the fashionable. So one of the main, real assertions of the book is just that as readers, as critical readers, we just have to find ways for thinking about how our own position in the world and the material structures we live in are actually shaping how we see the world, which is a rather obvious claim, but actually finding tools or techniques for talking about that in nuanced and effective ways can be really hard. So thinking about how fashion, for example, can help us to understand that our own moods or way we move through the world, are deeply connected to the global fashion system and the labor of the person who created the garment that I move through the world using, for example. So that really one of the takeaways is we have to use fashion to think about how we move through the world, not as these kind of autonomous knowing subjects, but as always entangled with particular histories and moments. And so I try to talk about how modernist writers have sort of anticipated that in some ways and given us ways to describe how that's happening, that we've kind of blown over, but that we should connect back to.
So much with that. Yeah. I think I need a minute to process, but it does, the way that clothing kind of controls and dictates your body and your movement through space, and it speaks to what you were talking about earlier with the new dress story, and how when she walks into the party and she realizes she's failed, basically, this attempt to be fashionable by being anti-fashionable, and how we don't necessarily even think about how much we feel when we have these clothes on our body, and whether we feel fashionable or whether we feel comfortable or whatever the language is that we're using, it's changing. Like, you can show up to a party and then you immediately want to leave because you're wearing the wrong thing. And that's the clothing. That's the way the clothing is like directing you, I think, is how I see all of this.
I just had a technical question, because you said that the book says that the new dress says that she's looked at a Paris fashion book at the time of empire. And which empire are we talking about? Is it the British Empire? Is it the French Second Empire? Is it the First Empire?
That's a great question. I think that ambiguity is part of why it's helpful that it's a text and not illustrated. I think that's kind of the point, is partly Mabel is just connected to this idea of empire that's a little bit free-floating. That said, since she says it's the time of her mother, I think it's the Second Empire, but part of what I think Woolf is trying to signal is exactly, it's just this idea of empire that she wants to connect to. So, yeah, but it's a good question.
I had this thought when I was looking at the photograph that you showed of her in Vogue wearing her mother's dress, and immediately my first thought was the 1930s like romantic revival and like this romanticizing of the past that happens, and the return to like things like a little bit of bustle in the back of some dresses, and more kind of the lace and like traditionally feminized materials come back into fashion. And it's almost like she's anticipating that, which is one of my favorite fashion theories, is that fashion anticipates, and it's, I think, also related to the people who are in this more avant-garde thinking and pushing against what is the current. And sometimes, again, making the old new, seeing Virginia Woolf in Vogue in 1924 wearing this horribly frumpy old-fashioned dress that then, to my eyes as the fashion historian, is like, oh wait, but that's so 1930s. It's right there, so trying to.
All through this whole process, I've been thinking about a story that I sometimes teach by Alice Walker called Everyday Use. Mm-hmm. You know the story? Yeah. For those of you who don't, it's...
It's good.
For those of you who don't, it's African-American family, and the older daughter has gone away to college and sort of become woke, I guess is the best way to put it, and is into her African heritage and has changed her name to a pseudo-faux African version. And while the one daughter who's, I think she has a disability, if I remember correctly, has stayed behind. And the discussion's all about the quilt that is made of the grandmother's old dresses. And the story just is talking about this quilt made of, and whose history are we reclaiming, I guess is what I keep thinking about in this discussion. Which past are we looking back to? Because the quilt means one thing to the older daughter, who's now into Africana, and a different thing to the younger daughter, it's her grandmother's dresses that made up this quilt. And I think that's a very sort of, even though this is a later text, I want to say it's the 50s, it still harks back to it harks back to this looking back to the past, and how we have sort of look at it with new eyes, look at these things with new eyes is what I keep thinking about, so in the course of this discussion. Are there any final comments before I ask for questions that anybody would like to make?
I just wanted to connect to one thing that you said, both on I think page 1 of the introduction, but also in your talk here, I have it too. About literary studies and fashion studies. Is the opinion really in literary studies that fashion is, and I'm paraphrasing, inconsequential, frivolous, and a sellout? Is that really still the dominant understanding?
Except for people working on fashion, yeah. Which I think has everything to do with literary studies anxiety that it's not doing meaningful things in the world. So that was part of one of the impulses in writing this book, that if you go, just was at a Modernist Studies conference, and granted, there are lots of panels for people doing really great work on fashion, but then if you listen to people not working on fashion, they'll often they may say things like, what I'm about to do is a little old-fashioned, or I know it's the fashion now to do X, Y, Z. And that rhetoric is a way of signaling that those who are doing the unfashionable, that's okay, because who cares that fashion has moved on? Fashion is a way for naming superficial change that we can resist. So that there's actually, even though academics are uninterested in fashion, they use the language all the time to signal what really matters effectively. So if you asked somebody who doesn't work on fashion, do you think fashion is silly? They might not say yes, but the way that they use the language of fashion to present their work often suggests that they do. But nobody pays attention to the fact that they use language like that, particularly.
Are there questions?
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Jerry. I'm sick, so I had to write my question down, and I'm sorry if it's a little disjointed. One of the definitions of modernism that you have agreed on is that part of it is to take the old and make it new, and you talked about the canon and the canonical and the non-canonical. My question is, how much is it also taking from the colonies and making it their own? So specifically in the first image, I'm not a fashion historian, so please, if this is something totally off, please let me know. Specifically in the first image that you showed, with the prince, with like the avant-garde and the prince, there were two people in the middle, and the first thing that came to my mind was it looked like a Palestinian keffiyeh. Do you know what that looks like? Mm-hmm. Right, so yes, how much do they mine from the colonies, and then something that is racialized then becomes new and European and white and fashionable and modern?
Yes, hugely so. So first recommendation for a book that I love, Urmila Seshagiri's Race and the Modernist Imagination. Yes, yeah. So that precisely argues that, yes, the innovations of British modernism are through an engagement with race as a kind of aesthetic category that often gets sort of detached actually from imperialism or colonialism in the British imagination.
Race versus colonialism.
That's right. Her argument,
okay.
That it gets detached as a kind of aesthetic category that might be possible. That said, you're absolutely right that, for example, I mean, you're the art historian, but if you talk about the beginnings of modernism, you know, Picasso's engagement with African sculpture is precisely the making new. So the old is also the contemporary that is elsewhere that is made new. So in the longer version of the talk that I gave, part of the claim that I make is that the new dress is also Woolf's thinking through of the ways that Bloomsbury's innovations are these effectively what we call sort of imperialist, anti-imperialist tools. That is, yes, they're trying to carve out a space for pacifism and conscientious objecting to the war, but they're doing it precisely by this imagined access to non-Western aesthetics and ideas, so that they're sort of reinscribing colonialism as they're also resisting imperialism.
And you're arguing that it's imagined. It's not necessarily from the coming, because these people were rich and they probably circulated with actual.
Yes.
Yes.
So some of the material is from Turkey. They did have silks from Turkey.
Okay.
Members of Bloomsbury went to Turkey. Woolf's sometime lover, Vida Sackville-West, spent time in Constantinople. Woolf's family had a lot of their money, as I think I mentioned, as colonial administrators in India. Okay. So it is both imaginative and quite literal. So Woolf lived off the money given to her by an aunt, which came from colonialism.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
In fashion, from its earliest days, it's all-consuming. It takes inspiration. It's cross-cultural. It's intercultural. I mean, there is no sort of pure, unless you're like on an island for some millennia. You know, it's like every fashion trend usually can be traced to at least two cultures. I think that they really, I mean, it takes inspiration from its earliest days, from intercultural contact, and yeah, very much in the 19th century, colonialism is all of the goods and motifs and literal labor that's feeding into the fashion system. You know, fashion doesn't discriminate in that sense.
It's true, and as the conversation was happening, I started thinking about in fashion, you could maybe change this, make it old, and make something old into something new, take the other, whatever the other is, into something new, because you can look at almost any kind of other and see that shifted into contemporary fashion.
Can I borrow this for a minute? Okay. And in terms of literature, we all know there are only 6 basic plots, so nothing's new.
But I mean, I think, is there a self-consciousness that it's an actual stealing from black and brown bodies? Like, is there a self-consciousness of it?
There is a growing self-consciousness in fashion in the 19th century. I mean, there is a movement towards abolition of slavery that, you know, British women particularly, that there is some burgeoning self-consciousness about it, but no, I mean, it's not a widespread understanding.
Yeah, I was thinking too, it's also like a promotion, especially when you're looking at like the African use of source material as kind of like the French colonial like propaganda campaign, where it's like highlighting these works as like trophies essentially. And so you start to see the references in textiles in the 1920s, more of the like the hyper interest in like Josephine Baker, for instance, and like the separation of like the person from like the body and like the symbolism and all of it. It's a really complicated subject that like I don't think there's enough scholarship that's really breaking this apart, and it seems like a great space that new scholarship could enter into, perhaps.
I would just add that, of course, the Harlem Renaissance is not reducible to modernism, but it's part of modernism, right? So there are very much active debates that sound incredibly contemporary, actually, in terms of thinking precisely about those questions. Who's profiting from, art produced by African American writers? So I think there is indeed. It depends on where you look in terms of who's aware and who's having the conversation there. I would just end with that.
Fitzgerald just saying the Jazz Age, he just could have taken ownership of that phrase.
Right, and interestingly, in that essay, though, if you read it too, he calls it the Jazz Age, yet manages to sort of nuance it in a way where it becomes Anglo-American men's style on Savile Row that is the center of the Jazz Age. So it's both indicating that indeed, black music is the inspiration and the shaping sort of mood of the decade, but that can be displaced also effectively to recenter, white men as the expression or the sort of authors of the decade too. So to that question of is there awareness? Well, yes, because Fitzgerald's doing that, which doesn't mean that he understands that he's criticizing himself for it, but he is at least, needing to work his way around precisely the way to both, appropriate that cultural production and then put himself at the center.
If I can just clarify, I'm
Right.
sorry, I think I meant awareness of the erasure of the body, of the racialized body.
Yes, there's a playing with it. I mean, I guess maybe this is being too semantic, but I guess it means the question comes back to partly what is awareness, as in, yes, because there's actually an erotic charge produced by imagining the absent presence of those racialized bodies, right? Is that awareness? In a sense, yes. Is it a critical awareness? Not necessarily, right? Okay. Yeah.
I'll ask a question. It's a bit, in my class, the gender and nationalism class that you're familiar with, the students read Feng Jitsai's novel, 3-Inch Golden Lotus, which is about foot binding. And it takes the ideas of the West and sort of turns everything upside down and spins it around, and is a fabulous little piece. Then they also read Zhang Ailing, as you know, and the essay they read today. In the essay that she wrote in 1943, she wrote, and she's the quintessential modern writer of China, and she was preoccupied with fashion, and her literature, as you know, is very, in a way, there's a similarness, there's an exquisite classical style to her writing, but there's also that lingering and slowing down of time and pondering upon leisurely description of a situation and a character. So we're slowly shown. It's very cinematic, her style. Different from Virginia Woolf, but there's some parallels. And in her description of fashion, which she's preoccupied and does lengthy descriptions, those of you not familiar with her, Ang Lee's film Less Caution is based on one of her stories. And she influenced Wong Kar-wai, like In the Mood for Love is deeply Zhang Ailing everywhere. But in her essay, she talks about how the Qipao itself transitioned into a more masculine direction, which was with no break, right? Which is surprising to many people. But then she talks about how the shift of the female form became more and more visible, and that traditionally the female body was literally buried under layers and was almost, to walk in that very traditional way where you don't see the body, and to sort of float and to sort of disappear. And her theory seems to imply that the idea of the modern woman, the Chinese modern woman, was a form-fitting, a movement towards minimalism and simplicity, but also emphasizing the body, which when you read it in a Chinese cultural context, it's one thing, but then when that image is interpreted by the West, it becomes this fetishized Orientalist, same thing with foot binding in a way, different. But I guess I'm just wanting to ask the panel if you have some thoughts on that sort of juxtaposition of the Eastern and Western interpretation of that, as one example of where that gets multi-layered in interpretation of the object of the Qipao. Like Hong Kong Museum, they tell the history of Hong Kong through the Qipao. That's one of their exhibitions. But that doesn't seem to be something that would be as obvious to a mainstream Western reader of that idea. So I guess I don't know if I have wait, let me see. My question is, yes, if you could speak to that moment of sort of juxtaposing meaning onto a Chinese fashion image by the West. That sort of doubling. That's not a question, but it's sort of a topic.
I don't feel like I can speak to that because I just don't have the knowledge of the Chinese fashion or the culture to really speak to it clearly.
Or in any cultural other examples of that happening. It's kind of building on Professor Aid's idea too.
Well, I mean, like I said, I think fashion is sort of rapacious in its sources of inspiration, but we also, know the cultures are relentlessly othering, so it doesn't surprise me, that we find these exotic ladies and we, sexualize them, the connection that came to my mind when you were talking about the emphasis on the body is that's a very post-Enlightenment move. That post-Enlightenment, I always bum out my students by talking about the downsides of the Enlightenment. And one of the downsides is this conception of the body as being more natural, and that fashion should be revealing that natural form, and that we need to get rid of affectation and the very broad silhouettes of the 18th century that had hidden the body, and that suddenly women are very much on display. And so it is this sort of move that one sees in fashion history, but I think we also then export it to other cultures as well, that we need to share our ideas, is the generous way of putting it. With these less enlightened cultures, we share the wisdom of the Enlightenment, and so then our body ideals and standards also get propagated out.
Briefly, this isn't about a fashion per se, but I think also there are ways of thinking about how there are different marginalized or racialized communities also communicating through aesthetic ideas. So, for example, just in the Harlem Renaissance, a lot of writers and intellectuals actually looked to Japan as a possible site of solidarity, of anti-white supremacist solidarity, but that solidarity precisely actually trucks in kind of certain Orientalist ideas about the connection between those communities. So there are lots of examples at this moment, indeed, of projection, of appropriation that are also, really interesting and sort of multi-directional. So imagining Japan through a certain kinds of aesthetics becomes actually a way of articulating a possible global vision of solidarity amongst people of African and Asian descent. So I think there's tons of really interesting examples of ways that that's happening.
I want to thank you all for coming this afternoon. Thank you for sharing your time with us. I want to extend a thank you also to Sarah and to Justine, and a very special thanks to Elizabeth Sheehan for joining us today. And I hope this will be the beginning of many more conversations on this topic with everybody here. Thank you.